This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Gents. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 212 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with food historian and author William Woys Weaver about pumpkins and squash. The plant profile is on closed bottle gentian, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on Purring Among Petals from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Dr. William Woys Weaver. He is an internationally known food historian and author of 21 books. Welcome, Dr. Weaver.
Thank you very much.
Such an honor to have you on the GardenDC podcast, and I'm so looking forward to talking about all things pumpkins and squash. But before we dive into that, we like to ask our first-time guests here on the podcast, were they born with chlorophyll in their veins and a green thumb?
Well, on that point, I think I was born genetically green. I grew up with my grandfather, and he was an extraordinary gardener. So from babyhood on, I was right out there beside him, learning all about what bees do to apple trees, how to breed tomatoes, how to save seeds. So it's sort of, I'm genetically programmed, if you would say, and wrote a book, Heirloom Vegetable Gardening, which sort of launched that whole thing.
Sounds like he was such a wonderful mentor to you. Do you have fond memories?
Oh, I do. In fact, he would lecture to me in the garden, and I didn't realize that he was really giving me good lectures. Later on in life, I discovered that this man was quite wise. He was a friend of a very famous African-American folk painter, Horace Pippin. And Pippin came to the garden many times, and they traded seeds. So one of the things that I've inherited from my grandfather is a collection of, well, the Roughwood seed collection, which is now online, and we can talk about that shortly. But anyway, some of the very unique things that came out of that collection from Pippin are now out there in the world as part of African-American culinary history, the fish pepper being one of them.
And I've grown the fish pepper for several seasons, and I must say thank you for that. It is delicious, makes a delicious sauce, and I know many who are grateful to have that back in our culinary traditions.
Well, we are growing it again this year because I've noticed a lot of seed companies that sell fish pepper are not selling true seed. They're not selecting the way they should. You know, that's an art. So we've got the fish pepper out in the garden, and it is pure. It's the original strain. We'll be offering that seed in the fall.
Oh, that's great to hear. So let's talk a little bit about that Roughwood seed collection, since you brought that up, and how can people purchase seeds? I think Rare Seeds offers it.
Well, actually, rareseeds.com is Baker Creek, heirloom seed company, and I recommend them highly for getting heirloom vegetables for your gardens and flowers. I write for them in their catalog, and Jer Gettle, who founded the company, started his business getting seeds from the Roughwood seed collection. So you might say we go back a long way. The Roughwood seed collection had no name. My grandfather started it in 1932. He died suddenly in 1956, and then I found his collection of seeds in the deep freezer in my grandmother's house and decided to thaw them out and see what we had. So that happened in the 60s and 70s. And now we've got the whole thing back up and going, over 5,000 heirloom seed varieties, and they are for sale through the Roughwood Center for Heritage Seedways, which is a nonprofit. It's www.seedways.org. And there's a big store of seeds and also books.
And you are based in Pennsylvania. And for our listeners who might not be that familiar with the geography of the area, can you describe how far you are, say, from Philadelphia, and also what your growing conditions are like?
Yes, the growing conditions here are, well, how can I say it? They're changing rapidly because of global warming. And we keep a journal here. So we have absolutely 40 years of data proving that things just go in earlier and ripen earlier and all of that. We used to be zone 6, but we're 7A. I think we're going to be 7B pretty soon. I'm in Devon, Pennsylvania, which is like 5 miles from Valley Forge Park and 15 miles due west as the crow flies from City Hall, Philadelphia. If that gives you coordinates.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great description. And I'm experiencing the same thing here, right outside of Washington, D.C., of planting a couple weeks earlier and then being able to leave things in and harvest them a couple weeks later every year.
Well, when I first moved here in the late 70s, we harvested the gooseberries and currants around July 4th. Now it is Memorial Day.
Wow.
You see what's happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been noticing it in strawberries and peas are the two things that for me seem so much earlier. So we're on this episode talking about pumpkins and squash, and I think we should start off with defining our terms. And so all pumpkins are a squash, but not all squashes are pumpkins.
Yes, this is a very arbitrary dividing line that we've created. I think mostly for the convenience of people who sell these fruits, they are fruits, and also for gardeners. It's an oversimplification because they are indeed all squash. They're all cucurbits. And then we divide this world of squash into winter and summer. But actually, if you go back to Native American squash, most of them were intended to be overwintered anyway, either dried or stored in some manner. So it depends on how you store them, how well they're going to make it through the winter. But there are squash that we have developed specifically for fall harvest and put away in a cupboard, and their flavors improve over the course of the winter. We have, for example, a variety in the seed collection which sells very well. It's called Quaker Pie Pumpkin. It's a moschata, Cucurbita moschata. That's its species, and it was released commercially in the 1880s. It belonged to a Quaker family in upstate New York. It was one of those burpy, sensational squash, and it's very good. It's not big. It's ideal for small gardens. And to give you an example of storability, we harvested it last August, and I cooked the last of them in June. So if you store them well, you can have them for 8 and 9 months in the cupboard. The winter squash.
And can you describe that storage? So in a dry space, I assume out of sunlight?
Yes, actually, I have an ideal cupboard for that. It's an old pantry cupboard. So it's got a window in it that I can open to aerate, to keep it cool. But it's dry, cool, and it's out of direct sunlight. And you put your squash on shelves and don't have them touch one another. There has to be air circulating around them. If you do that, you'll have them over the winter very easily.
And do you line the shelves with newspaper or parchment?
I don't do that. No.
Interesting. And how did the indigenous peoples of the region, how did they store it over the winter? I'm imagining, did they find a place underground to do so?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about pre-colonial squash, those are all the Cucurbita pepo species. The Native Americans didn't have the Maximus and the Mochadas that we commonly grow today. They only had Pepos. But they selected them for a wide variety of uses. Some to eat green. That's what the word squash means, akbash. You eat them green. The way we eat zucchini, zucchini is a green vegetable. We're not eating it when it's ripe. So they ate them green in stews. For storing, they dried them in the sun. They smoked them, and there were some that developed very hard rinds, and I think they stored them in baskets in their dwelling.
Interesting. And yeah, I was interested to read that so many of the squash can be eaten at a green stage. Like, it's never occurred to me to pick a green little pumpkin and to bite into it.
Oh, yes. I mean, they're all like zucchini when they're young like that. So they're perfectly good to eat. In fact, we have a mochada. It's actually a winter pumpkin from Guatemala in the garden right now. And we have lots of little babies, and they're not going to make it past frost. So, hey, they're going to go into the stew pot.
That's a great tip because, again, a lot of us gardeners are trying to, figure out that frost time and what we can pull, what will still be viable in the garden. So if you still have green squash on the vine, eat them straight.
That's true. And there's something else about the squash vines that a lot of people don't know. When I was at a food conference in Greece, Kalamata, by the way, where all the olives come from, I went into the market. I always do that kind of thing in foreign countries to see what the locals eat. And they take the young shoots. When you have squash with long vines, they're all over the garden. So there are people who like to keep them pruned. They take those young shoots with flowers and they stew them. They sell them in bundles with fennel or dill. So you might want to try that. It's not bad.
I can imagine this might be a little bit like a pea shoot. So you're eating the greens, basically.
Exactly. Exactly. They cook down to like spinach texture.
And what are your thoughts on pruning squash vines now that you brought it up? I've heard different advice. Some say it doesn't matter if you're pruning the vines or taking off some of the extra fruit, but only if you're trying to create something super large, like one of those giant pumpkins.
Yes.
And then others say you must prune.
Well, as a rule, I don't prune. If I have, for example, this Guatemalan squash in the garden, which is all over the map, I'm going to prune some of those because they're invading tomatoes and that kind of thing. But it's late in the season, so it's not going to matter about fruit production. The pruning issue is something that I've really stayed off of because there's something people need to know is that a lot of the female flowers on the vines are at the end. So the male flowers are closer to the center of the plant, and so if you start pruning, you're going to lose your ladies, and you're not going to have any babies. So I leave them alone. What we do here, since we're limited in space, we have tall wire cages, and we let the squash climb, and they love it. And actually, it keeps the fruit off the ground so critters can't nibble.
Yeah, that's so important, especially when you have some things that have a taste for squash, like little rodents coming through that will just take a couple nibbles or bites, but then ruin the fruit at that point.
Totally. They make it rot. Voles are, and chipmunks are notorious for that.
And so let's go back to maybe the ideal conditions for growing squash and how somebody who has never grown squash before would start with a pack of seeds that they got, an heirloom squash. They're standing in their garden plot with their pack of seed. What are their next steps?
Well, I would say if you've never grown squash before, you ought to start with something simple, not too challenging, because once you get the hang of it, then you can move on to other types of squash, which some of them are difficult. They're stinkers, in fact. But So maybe try zucchini. I mean, I don't grow zucchini. It's in every store. Why grow something that's so common? you know. And anyway, if I want something like zucchini, I can pick one of the small green ones that are on the vines. But if you're living in an area that's very hot and humid and rainy, I would pick a Cucurbita moschata species because they originate from Central America and they're much more resistant to rain, mildew, and even squash beetles, which is the bane of every squash grower's life. Mainly because they'll do better, although most of them are rather large in terms of taking up space. But your butternut squash is considered a winter squash, and it's a moschata, and that might be one that you want to try. A bush variety, for example, I would go with that.
Yeah, and I think that's something a lot of people would already be familiar with. They know what it looks like when it's ripe, and that might be something they're cooking with regularly. And so usually it's I would say at least a 3 foot by 3 foot space that you're going to set aside, correct?
Oh, yes. Well, we have raised beds that are about 20 by 20, but yeah, you have to give room for the squash because they have big leaves and they'll shade anything around them, and they want space. And they want. We plant ours in hills, and we make sure that the soil in the hill is new soil with lots of compost in it because squash are heavy feeders. If you want good squash, you got to keep them well fed. And by the way, we feed them organically with tea that we make from comfrey. We take the comfrey plant, put the leaves in tubs, and let it ferment until it turns into smelly black juice. That tea works on everything, and you can see the difference overnight.
Wow. Yeah, I have lots of comfrey, but I'm not using it that way. And now, Dr. Weaver, I am for sure making my own comfrey tea for watering my
Comfrey
squash.
is a very robust plant, so you can keep pruning it.
Oh, yeah.
And fermenting the leaves. We do that all summer. We have Bocking 14, which is a special variety that is not invasive and it does not reseed itself. It's a mutation.
And are those seeds for the Walking 14 available?
No, you can't get seeds. You have to get root
a division.
cuttings. That's the only division is the only way to do it. I am considering potting up Bocking 14 and getting it online with our seeds. We do plant sales, so I think maybe in the spring we'll start doing that. But we'd have to sell live plants. That's the root. The root of the Bocking 14 looks very much like a rhubarb root. Okay, not much to it, but they're very, very vigorous in growing. And by the way, the flowers attract bees, so they're good to attract pollinators.
Yeah, that's really why I'm growing it, is more for the pollinator attraction and also to add to the compost
pile. And you need
pile.
those bees, particularly if you have squash. The bees are out there at sunrise working the flowers. Fortunately, we have a neighbor across the street, and she's a beekeeper. She's got 10 hives, so we have no shortage of bees.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because I do hear from a lot of listeners that they are not getting the pollination on their zucchini and other squash as much as they were in the past. And I say, well, that's why you need to plant some marigolds or other pollinator attracting plants to your garden. But when it comes to hand pollinating, are there any advice that you give on that?
I hate hand pollinating. I'm sorry. It's just like, oh, that's my red line in the sand. But I know how to do it. And if push comes to shove, I have done it in the past. If you're going to hand pollinate, then you got to close up those flowers. So they're not, you just can't leave them open. You have to put tape on them so the other insects don't get in there. One of the problems we've been having with squash, and I know that we're getting a lot of this feedback also from our growers. We have growers in different parts of the country, by the way, is that this terrible heat that we had this past summer really stressed a lot of plants. And the tomatoes did not do well in the heat. but neither did a lot of the cucurbits, the watermelons, the melons, and the squash. Because when it gets super hot, those plants will drop their female flowers. They do that to protect themselves from the stress of the heat. So a lot of this problem about low productivity had to do with the heat. And the only way to get around that is to water the plants. And in fact, I've even considered putting some shady netting over them so that they weren't frying out there in the hot sun. It's close to 100 degrees, They can't take that.
Yeah, I've done the same. I throw cover cloth over on the hottest days and just make sure everything is well watered. And that does bring up that a lot of squash are, I would say, thirsty plants. That if you want some of those large size things, you're going to have to give it a lot of water.
Yes, and the guys that grow those gigantic pumpkins, which are basically inedible, but they weigh a ton or two. I mean, they feed them every day and they give them lots of water. That's how they get large. Yes, watering is absolutely vital when it comes to the cucumbers, even cucumbers, melons.
I would say, especially watermelon.
Yeah.
Or I think it definitely affects the flavor when we have like several weeks of drought. Do you notice that too?
Actually, that's true. I hate to say, but our soil is heavy around here, and it's very clay, and melons just don't like it. There's not much we can do, and so they just don't taste like the melons that are grown in South Jersey, where the evenings are hot and the soil is sandy. And there are a lot of soil adjustments you can make. I think what you've got to do is if you want to grow melons, for example, and you like melons, I would start experimenting with heirloom varieties that developed in your region, because they're probably in the long run going to taste better. We grew the Japanese chrysanthemum melon. We offer the seed online. This is a little small melon. It's very, very sweet when it's large, but the little ones are tasteless. So I asked the Japanese growers, what do? They pull off the little ones. They don't send those to market. They pickle the little ones like cucumbers. So, I mean, even if it's a melon that's not going to work as a melon, you can find other culinary uses for it. Nothing goes to waste here, by the way.
Interesting. And I noticed in your heirloom vegetable book, you talked about the male squash blossoms. If you don't have at that time a female to pollinate with on the vine, that you don't let those blossoms go to waste.
True. The male flowers are the largest, by the way, and those are the ones in towards the center. You can tell which is male and female because the female flowers will have a little green node under it, a little round bulb. That's the baby fruit waiting to happen, the baby squash. The males don't have that. But the male flowers are big, and you can stuff them and bake them. I mean, they're delicious.
And let's talk a little bit about seed saving. And so if I'm growing an heirloom squash or pumpkin and I want to save the seeds from it this year, do I leave one of them to really ripen on the vine, or do I pick that at the same time and just pull the seeds out and then dry them?
Well, since we're not growing food, we're growing for seed. We leave the squash on the vines until they're fully ripe. Then we put them away in storage and let them ripen until they're finger soft, almost rotten. But that is what we do to ensure that the germination rate of the seed will be very high. Because the longer the seed is inside the fruit and drawing energy from that soft area, it's called the placenta, by the way. It's drawing energy from that. The longer you can let the seeds stay inside the squash, the better, and the better germination rates you'll have. Once you've got the squash seed ready, we wash it off, we dry it on screens, and then we freeze our seed. That way you don't have to worry about the seed going bad. You'll have it for 10, 15, 20 years.
And that's a great explanation, too, of the sometimes low germination rate when you're getting a pumpkin, say, from a farmer at the farmer's market, and you're eating it, but you're saving some of those seeds. It's not fully ripe until what we would describe it as really being overripe, right? And almost,
Exactly.
I would say, I was going to say, way into its rotting stage.
Yes, somewhere, the texture is like a soft peach. Let's put it that way. Saving seeds from farmers' squash is very risky, not because there's toxins or anything, but they're growing several kinds of varieties in an open field.
Mm-hmm.
So if you save seed from that, you don't know what you're going to get. You're going to get mongrels, just all sorts of weird things.
Yeah, and I always tell people that, they say you can't save seed from a hybrid. You can, you're just not going to get that same thing.
No, you're going to get some sort of wild card with a hybrid.
Exactly. So you're still going to grow some kind of squash. It just won't be that exact squash that you bought.
The thing of it is, if you're growing these unknowns and you want it for food and it turns out to be a real dog, I mean, why did you bother?
Exactly. I would say most people are doing it as just a fun experiment at that stage. But yeah, if you're trying to grow something consistent and something to have for the table and for storage, you definitely want to go with proven seed. And is there a way you can guarantee, so you have one heirloom pumpkin growing and then in your next raised bed there's another squash growing? How do you prevent them from crossing?
Well, there are Cucurbita mixta, Cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita maxima, and Cucurbita moschata. Those are the four main groups of squash. You can grow one from each in your garden at the same time and they won't cross, okay? But if you have two moschatas in the same garden, whoops, they'll cavort. You're going to get all kinds of crosses. There's nothing you can do about it. Your squash has to be 2 miles away.
Yeah, and I'm growing in a community garden, so that's just not going to happen.
We have people who grow wonderful things in community gardens and they want to donate the seed, and I tell them we can't take it because it's all crossed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's the bees. The bees are doing it, but that's fine.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
So let's talk about some specific varieties. And I wanted to start with the Boston Marrow. And can you tell a little bit about that squash and then how you would prepare it?
Well, the Boston Marrow was introduced in the 1800s, and it's sort of one of those classic heirlooms, particularly for New England cooking.
Mm-hmm.
It It's well adapted to northern cooler summers that are dry and not humid, let's say. By humid, I mean like Mississippi. So it has its benefits for that reason. It's large in size, so you're going to need room. Basically, it's been used to make pies. But I'm very much interested in Latin American cooking because they do a million and one things with squash that we don't. And you can make squash candies. You can, aside from pies, squash pumpkin breads. I mean, and you start looking at the Native American recipes, squash cooked with cornmeal. I mean, there are a lot of wonderful things that you can do with these. You just have to get creative. I'll tell you, the squash, because they have a lot of beta carotene in them. They're healthy, and there are a lot of people who are going vegetarian or vegan, and they're starting to look at squash in a different way than other Americans. Not just Turkey Day pie, but year-round food. And this is good because we underutilize squash.
Mm-hmm. I think one of my favorite ways is as a pumpkin butter. So good.
Oh, pumpkin butter is wonderful. It's work, but once you've made it, you've got it all year round.
Mm-hmm. And because you're canning it, basically,
right,
putting it in a jar, yeah, it can last for years. And I was just gonna say as an aside that you were talking about pumpkin pie, but we're making basically squash pie. But it's funny that Americans don't like the term squash or squash pie, but we would say pumpkin.
Yes. Well, you'll find recipes for squash pie, quote unquote, in old 19th century cookbooks. But their idea of squash pie was a summer squash with maybe some corn and tomatoes thrown in, and beat some eggs, and it's sort of a custardy thing that's good on a hot summer day.
Mm-hmm. So more like we would almost consider like a zucchini casserole or
exactly,
some type of
exactly.
some type of savory.
Yes.
So let's talk next about the cheese pumpkin, just because I love that name.
You mean the Long Island cheese pumpkin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's another heirloom classic. I think one of the Philadelphia seed pumpkins, David Landreth, that's it. They introduced that many, many years ago. That's a moschata. So this is a squash that ultimately traces to Central America, but it was adapted for the New York market out on Long Island. And it's called cheese, not because it tastes like cheese, but because it's shaped like an old cheese wheel, squat, flat, and it was sort of whitish anyway. So it has this, from a distance, a cheese wheel appearance.
How I wish it tasted like cheese too.
Well, we're doing a fundraiser on Monday, and we're doing a recipe from Paraguay. It's called squash quieve, and you take one of those wonderful, flavorful squash, you cook it with masa harina and grated cheese. This takes polenta to another level.
Sounds wonderful.
Yes.
So next on my list is the Delicata Squash, and that's a pepo?
Pepo, yes.
Pepo.
Well, the Delicata is a cute little squash with green stripes, and it actually came out in the 19th century and has been very popular because it's due to its small size. It does well in small gardens, and it's very productive. I would say mostly people cut it down the center and they stuff it and bake it the way you would do a stuffed baked eggplant or something of that kind. It works very well for that. The Delicata is actually a horticultural improvement taken from a Native American squash that was called green striped maycock. So the green striped maycock of the Lenape Indians is actually like the great-great-grandmother of Delicata. So there you go.
Interesting. And I'm looking at a photo of the finger squash or crown of thorns.
Yes.
And that one I've never tasted or grown, not very familiar with it, but you said there's a misnomer that it was known as the Yugoslavian finger squash.
Now, the misnomer has crept into the garden literature. It's rather annoying because it's not from Yugoslavia. It was introduced commercially in 1888 by David Landreth of Philadelphia. He shipped seeds to Europe all the time. So this seed ended up in a Yugoslavian seed bank, and then someone got USDA, I think, got the seed from them, and then someone got the seed from USDA, and because it came from Yugoslavia, it must be a native to that country. It is not. It is a known squash, documented in the 1770s as Native American East Coast, and in fact, it's from New Jersey. It comes in 3 colors: dark green, white, and yellow.
Mm. Yeah, that explains how pretty it is.
Yes, and it's got white flesh. And the seed companies, Landreth among them, likened the flavor to pineapple. And in a sense, if you start to think about that squash as pineapple, you can make pineapple pie with it and fool folks.
Maybe a fruit salad?
Yeah, why not?
So let's talk about one of the most famous of the winter squashes, and that's the Hubbard squash.
Yes, that's another New England squash. And it's a big one. Again, it's good for storing. I think that has been one of its perennial pluses and why people have bothered to grow it. It's grown a lot around here up in the Pennsylvania Dutch country because it's good storing squash and they can make a lot of things with it over the winter. Again, it was used a lot for pies, but I would say experiment with the recipes and see what you can do. Mm-hmm. It has good flavor.
Yeah, I think it's a very consistent one, and that's probably what made it such a popular heirloom.
Also, I've discovered with Hubbard that if you can cook it together with sweet potatoes, and if you're going to make a pie, for example, so you can get this combination that's really quite good. One enhances the other, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds delicious. So next on the list is patty pan or cymling squash.
Yeah, the cymlings, patty pans. Those are pepos. Those are Native American to the East Coast, Eastern woodland heirlooms. They come in a lot of different shapes and colors. They were called cymlings in old cookbooks and in the 18th and 16th century because they look like cymlings. What are cymlings? Well, on Fat Tuesday in England, they would make this cake. Well, it's basically like fry bread, if you know what I mean. You take cake batter or this sweet dough and you drop it into boiling oil, and it makes this ruffled, edged fat cake, all right? And that's a cymling, and they serve them in England on Fat Tuesday, and that's where the word comes from. So the name cymling simply means that the squash resembles fat cake.
Oh, thank you for that. I'd always wondered what cymling meant, and so that sounds like a delicious fried donut with that curvy edge to it.
Oh yes, this is pure sin.
But the patty pan itself, I think it's very versatile squash.
Patty pan there are lots of recipes, even in early American cookbooks, using it. Basically, they stew it with butter, and that's the old-fashioned way. But you can take that to a lot of different levels, and you can make interesting sauces. Yes, versatility is absolutely the key word there with the summer squash.
Plus, they're darn cute.
Yeah.
And I think of all the ones that we're talking about today, if I was to introduce a child to growing squash, I would say that one.
Yes, I think that crossed my mind as I was talking earlier. The finger squash or the patty pan, particularly the patty pan, if you want to introduce children into the world of food, where it comes from and how it grows, there's a good plant to start with. And since they move quickly, the impatient child will be entertained by the day-to-day changes that happen on these squash.
Mm-hmm.
And also walk the child through the method of cooking it so that this becomes seed to table, okay? Because that's what we're all about.
Mm-hmm. And collecting the seed.
Yes.
And then planting it next year.
Yes.
And I was going to say that one of the fun activities to do with a kid in a squash is to carve your initials or a picture or something into the skin. Have you ever done that?
No, I never have. I've been too busy weeding.
Sometimes you could just do it almost with your fingernail.
You could.
And just do a little sketch. And I'm thinking more for obviously ornamental pumpkins that you might want to put on your porch, not necessarily for cooking.
Yeah, well, there are people that do this as an art form, and some of the things are fantastic. So, I am devoted to the seed saving and the recipe end of it. At the end of the day, there are only 24 hours, you know?
Yes, exactly. So let's move on to the Maxima family of squashes. So I'm looking first at Pike's Peak or the Cybling Squash.
Cybling, that's correct. This is one that's popular, particularly in the upper Midwest. It came out of the upper Missouri River basin. It's a Native American squash. I think it was commercially introduced out of Missouri. But anyway, it's from that part of the country, and it does very well in the Midwest. I have it in heirloom vegetable gardening because it's one of the classics. There's no question about it. Good flavor and good storing qualities. I think that's what the Native Americans were looking for when they developed that.
Mm-hmm. And we'd already touched on the Quaker Pie Pumpkin, but is there something more you want to add about that?
No, it's it's extremely easy to grow, and we train it up over trellis, so it doesn't take up a lot of room in the garden, and it's highly productive. I recommend that one particularly.
And earlier you had referred to some of those stinkers, some of the ones that are hard to grow that you wouldn't recommend for the beginner squash grower. Can you name some of those tougher varieties to grow, and what are the challenges around them?
Well, we got a squash from Guatemala. It's a pepo. It should do very well, and we planted it. It did not produce any fruit. And yes, it was hot, but it's hot in Guatemala. So I was trying to go through what was going wrong here. And, we forget that a lot of garden plants did not evolve in North America, are day length sensitive. So this squash really needs 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, like on the equator, in order to set flowers. And there's no way I can move the sun. So these are things you learn sort of hard knocks way. The only way I could deal with that would be to grow the squash in a greenhouse with, artificial light to trick it into imagining that it has 12 hours of daylight.
Yeah, I think that would be a lot of excess growing conditions.
Yeah, those would be the most expensive squash in the world after all the utility bills are paid.
Exactly. I don't think we need to replicate the sun, especially for something like that, a field-grown plant. But it does bring up, if you are in, say, a shady type garden, don't have access to full sun, are there any squashes you can grow?
Well, to be honest with you, I have not found one. I mean, they'll struggle. They'll do their best, but they really need that full sun. And anyway, if they're in the shade, they're not going to develop good flavor. They need the sun. The sunlight on the skin of the squash is what helps the squash produce the sugars to give them their distinct taste. So the sunlight's very important there.
All right. So for our listeners out there with shady gardens, borrow a friend's sunspot.
Or if you've got a sunny balcony, you could do it in a tub. It's tricky, but it's doable.
Yeah, I have a neighbor who lines their front sidewalk kind of with milk jugs or large tubs and puts squash seeds, and they're growing them just for the blossoms, though.
Oh, well.
So they're just trying to get hundreds of blossoms, and they're basically, their front yard is just all squash vines.
Yes. Okay. Well, that works. I mean, they have a goal and they're going to it directly.
Exactly. So let's talk about one last variety, and that's the Turk's cap or turban squash.
The turban squash is documented by the French botanist Gentian as being a Native American variety from the East Coast. And he has watercolors showing it in various colors. So we know its genealogy is Native American. It comes in different colors and shapes, but basically it has this squat turban-like shape to it, hence the name. And it develops a very hard woody skin, but that means it's good as a good storing squash, and it will keep for most of the winter. I found that because the shell is so hard, I can simply cut the squash open, take off the lid, so to speak, take out the seeds and bake it in its shell. And after it's baked and it's soft, you just scoop it out with a spoon, and then you've got this almost like wooden bowl.
Yeah, I think a lot of the squashes, they have that hard rind. I think there's a bottle squash that also is similar that you can use for storing after that.
I have actually kept some of the hard-shelled squash and made utensils for fun, but I use them in my photography. So why not?
Yeah. And it's a pretty cool extra thing you can get out of them.
That's what the Indians did. I mean, they didn't throw those skins away.
No. And would you recommend wiping them down with like a light bleach solution for storage, or how do you get that rind to last?
No, I don't touch them, actually. I don't put anything on them. I've never tried to do that. I've never had reason to. I think if you have a house that's cool and damp, you may have a mold problem. But that goes back to, store them in a dry, cool closet. And dry means if you've got a humidity issue in your house, I would put a dehumidifier or something in that little space to keep it separate from, the ambient temperature and air in the house.
Good advice. Yeah, I do know several gourd artists who, they'll do the light bleach solution as a wash, and then they'll kind of wax it after it's thoroughly dry.
Yeah, well, that has to do with their end product, what they're looking for. They don't want blemishy looking sculptures, right?
Exactly. So, Dr. Weaver, are there any squashes that are favorites of yours that we didn't talk about yet? And I know it's like picking, a favorite among kids.
Well, I don't really have favorites. I like them all for different reasons. They all have such special personalities. They keep me entertained. So I can honestly say I don't have a favorite. And I would never say that in the garden within earshot of the squash.
And I was going to say the squash have ears.
Talk to them. They'll do better.
And so how can our listeners contact you to find out more?
If they want to get heirloom seeds from us, just go to our website for the Roughwood Center for Heritage Seedways. It's www.seedways.org. We've got close to 400 or 500 things up online right now, and more is on the way once our fall harvest is in.
Great. And you had mentioned that you do some in-person sales in the spring. So if somebody is around the Mid-Atlantic area, when should they look for that? Is there a newsletter or somewhere else that they get notified?
You can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
and it will keep you informed on what we're doing and where we're going to be.
Terrific. All right. So, Dr. Weaver, any last thoughts on squash growing, especially for those who might be an ornamental gardener and they're not much of a culinary or edible garden grower?
Well, I mean, you can grow squash and make beautiful arrangements for your dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
That'll get the conversations going.
Exactly. And how about some of those really cool-looking, warty, wonderful squashes?
Oh, there's a whole family of squash that have the warts on them. We call them sugar warts in Pennsylvania
Mm-hmm.
because it's caused by a sugar buildup in the skin. So, by the way, if you're out in a farmer's market and you want to find good flavored squash, go to the ones with the warts. They're going to taste the best.
Well, there you go. The warty ones are the ones you want. Thank you so much, Dr. Weaver, for sharing and for letting us know some of the heirloom background of some of these wonderful squash and all those great growing tips.
Thank you, too, for allowing me to talk about it and to share the Roughwood seed collection with your listeners.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Gentian plant profile. Closed bottle gentian, Gentian andrewisii, is native throughout the northeastern half of the United States. It is a perennial wildflower with blue-purple blooms that are nearly closed at the tip. They are arranged in tight clusters atop the stem, and at full bloom will look like they are buds about to open fully, though they never do. There are also some naturally occurring white versions of this flower. Closed bottle gentian is hardy to zones 3 to 7. These plants are slow-growing but long-lived and are very low maintenance. They bloom from late summer into mid-fall and are not bothered by an early frost. They grow best in moist, rich soils, either in full or part sun. Bottle gentian is pollinated by bumblebees that pry open the flower to crawl inside and sip nectar, plus deposit pollen. Gentian, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, the toad lilies are starting to bloom at the base of my gazebo, and over at the community garden plot, the best looking thing there is a self-sown holy basil that is taken over a container I left vacant there this year. In garden tips that we shared on our social media this week, we instructed you on the proper way to pick an apple, which is to twist the apple like a doorknob rather than to pull it or yank it off the tree. So that way you're not causing any damage to the branch or the tree. And we also shared the symptoms of aster yellows, which is a virus spread by sucking insects. Symptoms are flowers with distorted petals, immature green petals, and distorted center cones, often with many flowers sprouting from the center. You'll see this commonly in members of course, the aster family. And one piece of great news I wanted to share is that the Ladies in the Landscape has now offered a scholarship, and that's to support young women who are interested in pursuing a career in horticulture. And They are awarding $500 towards their higher education. You must be a high school student and enrolled or planning to be enrolled in a horticulturally related field. And you can see the details and submit your application at ladiesandlandscape.com/scholarship. In local gardening events, if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, you might be interested in attending the Ujamaa Cooperative Farming Alliance's Fall 2024 Workshop and Convening in Accokeek, Maryland. And this is taking place on Saturday, October 26th. It's open to the public. Pre-registration is required. There will not be registration on the event day. There will also be a convening the next day on Sunday, October 27th, and you can find out more information about that at UjamaaFarms.com. That is UJAMAA Farms.com. And upcoming is the 2024 Eco-Savvy Faire at Green Spring Gardens in Alexandria, Virginia. I will be the keynote speaker, and the theme of this year's event is Small Space in Urban Gardens, Plants Where You Live, Embracing Eco-Savvy Gardening Techniques. That takes place on Saturday, November 2nd from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. You can find out details and register for that online. The fee is $35, and the website is fairfaxcounty.gov parks/Greenspring/Eco-Savvy Gardening Faire. I hope to see you there. Happy gardening.
This is The Last Word by Christy Page at Greenprints, with Purring Among Petals, a story by Kathy Klein. In early June, as I was admiring my white hydrangea mopheads mingling with the Dr. Seuss-like red bee balm, a furry black and white head emerged amid the Annabelles. Summer, one of my feral cats, in the most exotic bloom in my garden, blinked her owlish eyes at me and surveyed her domain. I welcomed Summer and her companions into my life during December, a time when my garden lay dormant, wrapped in winter's embrace. Sheltered in large crates on my deck, overlooking the desolate landscape, they timidly ventured forth into their new home. Summer, Shelley, and Sandy, each with their unique markings, were tasked with curbing the local rodent population, though they seemed initially hesitant to embrace their newfound freedom. With gentle encouragement, they began to explore, venturing into neighboring yards, always returning to the sanctuary of my garden. As winter thawed into spring, they flourished, becoming integral parts of the garden's tapestry. Amidst the lush growth, they found joy in playful ambushes and lazy afternoons basking in the sun. Unexpectedly, they also sought affection, weaving themselves into the fabric of my daily life. Summer, in particular, became a constant companion, her purrs a soothing melody as she rubbed against my legs, demanding attention. Shelley, too, surrendered to the allure of human touch, while Sandy maintained her aloof demeanor, observing from a distance. Beyond companionship, they became my gardening allies, albeit in their unique ways. Unkinking hoses, kneading grass, and providing an ample supply of fertilizer, they added their own touch to the garden's upkeep. Occasionally, they even proved their worth by warding off unwanted visitors, though their pursuits sometimes veered into playful mischief. As summer waned and autumn approached, I reflected on the joys and challenges of another gardening season. Amidst the inevitable setbacks, my feral trio remained a constant source of beauty and amusement. They reminded me that perfection in the garden is elusive, but the magic of companionship, both feline and floral, is ever present. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with hashtag GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.